Evet, tekrar merhaba. Evet, tekrar merhaba. Yeniden buradayız. Şimdi önceki dersi Campbell'dan anlatmıştım. Şimdi biraz daha farklı bir kitapta, daha değişik bir kitaptan anlatacağım. Bu anlattığım ikinci dersin notlarını size vereceğim. Çünkü bayağı bir özetleyip anlattım. Zaten birinci chapter'ı sadece evrime giriş anlamında. YouTube'u bir kontrol edip dönmek istiyorum. YouTube'dan da soru sorma özelliğini açıp hemen geliyorum. Evet, buraya yapıştırdık. Eğer YouTube'dan buradan Perkulus'tan izleyemezseniz YouTube'dan izleyebilirsiniz. Zaten Perkulus'ta da 2 kişi var ama YouTube'da demin sanırım 19 kişi falan vardı. Son olarak bir de telefondan kontrol edelim YouTube'umuzu. Ondan sonra tekrar başlayabiliriz. Evet, Evolution-2 diye girdim. Evet, güzel. Orada da var. Şimdi evrim konusundaki terimler üzerinde çalışmaya devam ediyoruz. Terimleri öğrenmeye devam ediyoruz. Şunu alsam sanırım daha iyi olacak. Evet, evet, sesimiz de iyi. Tamam, devam edebiliriz. Evet, okay. So let's make another introduction to evolution. So we have already introduced. We have already introduced, but let's make another introduction because these terms are very important, especially for you to understand the biological issues, biological subjects. First of all, you have to be able to describe what evolution is. By the way, after finishing these slides, by the end of these slides, I'm going to explain everything in Turkish, so we will make a Turkish hour today as well. Evolution, that means change. Evolution is change. Biological evolution is change in the properties of groups of organisms over the course of generations. Individual organisms do not evolve. So when we say biological evolution, which is seen in the organisms, that's not individual change. That is change in the groups of organisms. So always you have to remember that individual organisms do not evolve. Groups of organisms do evolve. Those groups of organisms are populations. They are called populations. So individual organisms do not evolve. Groups of organisms do evolve. Populations undergo descent with modification. So how does it work? Evolution of population. Populations may become subdivided. Several populations are derived from a common ancestral population. So there is one population exists, then that population divides into two separate populations. So it's separated. The first population is separated into two new populations. These are our new populations with a common ancestral population. The populations, then these two separate new populations diverge. They become different from each other by the time. These processes have continued over vast periods of time. Results: emergence of millions of different forms of life, all having descended with modifications from the universal common ancestor of all known living organisms. So what are these evolutionary changes? If evolution is change, then we have to look at what are these change? What kind of changes are these? How can we define them, describe them? Changes that are passed via genetic material from one generation to the next are evolutionary changes. So if a change is evolutionary change, then it has to be passed through the generations, from previous generations to the next generations, and we know that that is possible only with genetic material, which is DNA or genome. Over the course of many generations, many such changes may accumulate. Biological evolution may be slight or substantial. Different forms of a gene within a population, that's one kind of biological evolution. I hope you can remember. We call these different forms of one gene alleles, which then we can say formation of new alleles is an example for evolution. The alterations that led from the earliest organisms to corals, grasshoppers, and humans. Example, so in the previous hour we gave this example, antibiotic resistance. Before 1940s, most people in the hospitals did not have cancer or heart disease. They suffered from tuberculosis, pneumonia, and many other bacterial infections. In 1960s, the medical situation changed after discovery of antibiotic drugs. Today, we confront the new infectious diseases, but also resurge of old diseases like tuberculosis. So there is something very important you have to notice here. In 1940s, when you look at the people in the hospitals, you wouldn't see patients suffering from cancer or heart disease. You would see only the patients suffering from tuberculosis, pneumonia, and many other bacterial infections. So since today we got rid of all these, or most of these bacterial infections, we suffer from cancer and heart disease mainly. The same bacteria are back by the time, but now they are resistant to penicillin, ampicillin, and many other antibiotics used before. Staphylococcus aureus, which we gave in the previous hour, it's the example we gave in the previous hour. Neisseria gonorrhea is another example, gonorrhea, and more. There are a lot of other bacterial species which were which we were able to treat with antibiotics, but they're resistant today to those antibiotics. Then we have a question here. Do the drugs cause drug-resistant mutations in bacteria? Let's go back to Darwin's evolutionary theory first, and then we will explain how the bacteria get resistance or gain resistance against antibiotics. The origin of species contains two major theses. 1. Descent with modification. 2. Natural selection. What does it mean? Descent with modification means all species, living and extinct, have descended without interruption from one or few original forms of life. Species that diverge from a common ancestor are very similar at first, but by the time they accumulate differences over great spans of times, they may come to differ radically from each other. At this point, we have to look at another term, natural selection, and principle of preservation. survival of the fittest, variational theory of change. So, 3 points that we have to understand, or 3 points we have to explain natural selection. Principle of preservation, survival of the fittest, variational theory of change. What's Darwin's evolutionary theory then? Darwin's evolutionary theory includes 5 theories. 1. Change in the characteristics. 2. Common descent. 3. Gradualism. 4. Populational change. And 5. Natural selection. Changes in the characteristics. What are they? The characteristics of lineages of organisms change over time. Common descent species had diverged from common ancestor. Gradualism, the differences between even radically different organisms have evolved incrementally by small steps through intermediate forms. Populational change, evolution occurs by changes in the proportions of individuals within a population. Not all of them, not just one of them, but proportions of individuals within a population. Population that have particular inherited characteristics. Changes in the population of different types of individuals are caused by differences in their ability to survive and reproduce. These 2 words are the ones you have to keep in mind. Survive and reproduce. To survive and to reproduce. So changes in the population consisted of different types of individuals. So there is a population. It has hundreds of thousands of individuals. And those individuals are different than each other. So those are in different types. And that difference is caused by differences in their ability to survive and reproduce. Also, this difference, the difference between the individuals in a population, cause the differences in their ability to survive and reproduce. Such changes result in evolutionary adaptations. In this picture, you can see how the evolutionary changes accumulate. So we have a common ancestor here. After a time period, this common ancestor is the same, but it diverges. Then one branch goes without differentiating, but a second branch has a difference, has a modification. Then this branch is divided to 2 new branches as well, and one branch gains new modifications, but the other branch doesn't have those modifications, but the individuals in this branch has totally different modifications. Then when you look at the ends of branches, the tips of branches, the individuals will look totally different. Fundamental principles of evolution. 1. The phenotype is different than the genotype. So you should remember our genetic lectures. Different genotypes may produce the same phenotype. For example, heterozygote genotype and homozygosity of one allele may produce the same phenotype. Then the phenotype can be different than the genotypes, because also we have environmental factors and gene interactions which act on the genotype to produce the phenotype. Environmental effects on an individual's phenotype do not alter the genes. This is the most important thing. Even if you change the phenotype of an individual, by the environmental effects, you cannot change its genotype. Hereditary variations are based on the genes that retain their identity as they pass through the generations. They do not blend with other genes. Genetic variation arises by random mutation and recombination. So for changes in the genes, you need mutations. 5. Evolutionary change is a populational process. Change in the genotype frequencies may be random or non-random. Natural selection can account for both slight and great differences among species. Natural selection can alter populations beyond the original range of variation. Populations can accumulate considerable genetic variations. Populations of a species in different geographical regions differ in characteristics that have genetic bases. The difference between different species and between different populations of the same species are often based on differences at several or many genes. Species are a group of interbreeding or potentially interbreeding individuals that do not exchange genes with other such groups. So this is an important description. This is a very important description. I remember we explained what species means before, but here you can remember again. Species are groups of interbreeding or potentially interbreeding individuals that do not exchange genes with other such groups. Speciation usually occurs by the genetic differentiation of geographically segregated populations. Higher taxa arise by prolonged sequential accumulation of small differences rather than by the sudden mutational origin of drastically new types. All organisms form a great tree of life that has developed by branching of common ancestor into diverse lineages. Alright, do you have any questions up to this point? Evet, buraya kadar soru var mı? YouTube'da soru varsa chat'e yazabilirsiniz. Evet, YouTube'dakiler chat'e yazmanız için birazcık bekliyorum. Perkulus'takiler iyi misiniz? Duyabiliyor musunuz beni? Sesiniz soluğunuz çıkmıyor. Perkulus'ta 2 kişi var zaten. Peki, evet siz Perkulus'ta olduğunuza göre size soruyorum. Buraya kadar anlattıklarımı bir de Türkçe anlatmamı ister misiniz? Tamam, o zaman kısa bir ara daha verelim. Orada ben YouTube'daki yayını tekrar başlatayım. O zaman bir 10 dakika daha ara veriyoruz. Ve de sonra tekrar başlıyoruz. 10 dakika sonra görüşmek üzere.